about research methods and the experiment in particular. This is one of the important aspects of any social science course because it shows how we get our opinions and we're able to test those systematically so that our findings have some ability to be redone and checked by others and some reliability and validity in our own minds. Have you ever met anybody who said that they drink lots and lots of caffeine and they'd get out in your face and they go, "Caffeine doesn't bother me," and they're just a nervous wreck? Well, we can test this idea if caffeine affects people in general or just people specifically. And today I want to take a look at the experiment in general first and then apply it to this idea of does caffeine affect people's behavior. And I can kind of give you an anecdote beforehand. The caffeine dramatically affects my behavior in ways that took me years to figure out. And this study means a lot to me because of that reason, I guess. The experiment in general is a powerful research method. And let's just talk about how it's used in psychology. And for example, there are several things we have in an experiment. We have one group that's the experimental group or experimental condition in some way or another. I'll call it the experimental group. And at least one other group that's a control group or a control condition. And what we're going to do is compare these two. The control group is going to be treated as normal. So for example, in this study, they wouldn't get caffeine. In an experimental group, they'll get higher levels of caffeine of various sorts or something of that nature. So the experimental group is who gets the independent variable. And that's not exactly an accurate way of saying it, because the independent variable is across the board. There's just different levels of the independent variable. In the case of the caffeine study, you'll have a couple of different groups who get different levels of caffeine and a control group who gets none. The independent is seen as the cause variable. And we're looking to look at effect or results, and that's our dependent variable. And you do this across the board in the control group as well. The control group gets a different level of the independent variable, which is without whatever product you're trying to test or drug you're trying to test in this case. And then you have an outcome that might be some emotional measure or something of that nature. And then you compare results. So the dependent variable are the effects, or sometimes just referred to as results. In fact, kind of a key way to figure out what the independent and dependent variables are is to start with the dependent variable, because it depends on the independent. So take a look at the results of your study, and then go backwards and say, okay, what caused those results to be different between the experimental group and the control group? Now let's look at the caffeine study in particular. This study was done by a couple of psychologists named Velber and Templar. I don't know if you can get that on the camera or not. Velber and Templar. And they did a study that was very, very powerful. It's been redone in a lot of different ways. Essentially, they found a group of people, and they found people who were high caffeine drinkers, they found people who were medium caffeine drinkers, and they found people who were low caffeine drinkers. So step one in this particular experiment, this is the caffeine experiment. Step one in the caffeine experiment was that they found people who were low, medium, and high in daily caffeine intake. This pin is dying up on it, so I'll try that one here. Low, medium, and high in caffeine intake. And so these were three kind of distinct groups. And what they wanted to do to form their real groups was to make the three groups as similar as possible. So step two was they took some people out of the people who had 0 to low intake of caffeine every day, and they put them in this group. And this is the group that will receive low, or actually 0 milligrams of caffeine. They call it the low caffeine group. It's actually the 0 caffeine group. They took some out of the medium and some out of the high to form that group. They did the same over here. This was the medium group, medium levels of caffeine group, and they received medium levels of caffeine. And some of them came from the original low to 0 amount of caffeine group. Some came from the medium, some came from the high. And then the last group, of course, you can see the same pattern. And this is the group that would receive high dosages of caffeine in the study. And they picked some of those from the low, some from the medium, some from the high. Why would you do that? Well, what they're trying to do is to get some kind of control in the study so that it's not just bias creeping in. They want each of the three groups to be comparable in the types of people that are in them. The third thing they then did was give a pretest. And this was a pretest that was an emotional variable check score that's kind of standard in psychology. And they tested things such as anxiety, depression, and hostility. Now, some of us are very aware that caffeine causes one or more of these things in us, but that's anecdotal information. It's a powerful place to start. It's where we get our hypothesis. So the hypothesis here, which is an educated guess, the hypothesis is simply caffeine will increase anxiety and hostility, but decrease depression. Now, all those kind of make common sense. So why would we do a study? Well, you'll find out, because sometimes the results of the studies fit common sense, and sometimes they don't fit common sense at all. Caffeine will increase anxiety, hostility, and decrease depression. So anxiety and hostility are active types of negative feelings, and depression's a slow down negative type or a downer type of feeling. And so you'd think that a drug like caffeine, which hypes you up, would decrease depression, make people feel better, right? So they give a pretest, and they're measuring anxiety, depression, hostility. Number 4, they give the independent variable, which is caffeine, and they give it in the following manner. They give 0 milligrams of caffeine to the first group. They drink a cup of decaf coffee. They don't know what the study is about. They put some powder in it, and this powder happens not to have any caffeine in it. They give the medium group medium levels, which was like 2 or 3 cups of equal to 2 or 3 cups of coffee. They give the high group higher amounts of caffeine. Now, what you find is we're also talking about something called a double-blind technique. What's a double-blind technique? Well, what that means is, did the people in the study know what the study was about and know which group they were in? No. They didn't know what the study was about, and they didn't know which group they were in. Why would you want that? Well, you want that so that they can't bias the results and change things but what they think should happen. It's a double-blind technique because the people making the judgments about the anxiety, hostility, and depression don't know either which person is in which group. That's all secretly done and tabulated separately so that you control for the bias of the people being experimented on, and you control for the bias of the people who are the experimenters. They gave independent variable caffeine. So these folks got 0 amount, these people got medium levels of caffeine, these people got high amounts of caffeine, and then finally they gave a post-test of anxiety, depression, and hostility. All right? Now, remember, our hypothesis was caffeine will increase 2 of those, anxiety and hostility, but will decrease depression. Now, let me erase this, and we'll take a look at the actual results from these 2 researchers' findings that have very practical results for us, of course. And I'm going to tape that up on the board. See if we can zero in on that real closely. Do we have that frame pretty good? Good, excellent. Now, if you look at this, let's look at anxiety. This is his first group, and you probably can't read the words, but you can see the bars. The group who had low amounts of caffeine had the least increase in anxiety. The people who had the high amounts of caffeine, or medium amounts of caffeine, had the medium increase in anxiety. The people with the high amounts of caffeine had the most increase in anxiety. Caffeine doesn't bother me. Remember that? All right. Now, let's look at hostility. Same pattern. 0 milligrams of caffeine, slight increase in hostility, but hardly any. Moderate amounts of caffeine, moderate amounts of increase. High amounts of caffeine, even higher increase. Not as dramatic as the first group. Do these 2 fit our hypothesis? We hypothesized that hostility and anxiety would increase, and it's relative to the amount of caffeine. Absolutely, it fits the hypothesis. It's common sense. Why would we do the study? let's look at the third part of the hypothesis. Notice the people who had low amounts of 0 milligrams of caffeine, their depression didn't decrease as we predicted, it increased slightly. When they had medium amounts of caffeine, it didn't decrease or disappear, it increased proportionally to the medium amounts of caffeine pretty much, and the people who had high amounts of caffeine, their depression increased also. So what we have here is two parts of our hypothesis are backed up, one part of our hypothesis is not. So hostility and anxiety increased with the different levels of caffeine, but depression also increased. Now let's look at a practical application of this. I had a friend who used to be the director of Adolph Meyer Mental Health Center in Decatur, Illinois, and when he brought in married couples for marital counseling, he, number one, bought this study and many others like it that back it up, and number two, he also looked at a lot of the research on violence in videos, violence on TV, violent video games, and we've done over 20,000 of those studies, by the way. And so what he would argue is that based on the research, he would tell the couple, all right, I want both of you to reduce the amount of caffeine you're taking in because you'll be able to hold back, not make as many negative comments, and you'll benefit from therapy better. You'll be able to deal with each other on a more rational basis if you reduce the amount of caffeine. And most people, of course, thought, that's kind of silly, and then he'd share this or other studies with it. The second thing that he did, he said, okay, for the males, we have research, not so much for females, but we have research for males, that the more violence on TV, movies, or video games that we watch or get involved in, it doesn't seem to serve as a catharsis like Freud argued, in other words, getting rid of our emotions. It actually seems to increase our hostility and aggression. So for him, the first thing he'd do was reduce caffeine intake for male and female before therapy would start. Second thing was reduce the amount of violent TV, video, movies, and video games that his male patients watched. And once they agreed to do that and did it for a couple of weeks, then he would start therapy. And his anecdotal feeling was that therapy was much more effective when he got these two things under control. Notice this is, again, a biological sort of influence. The caffeine itself changes our behavior. Notice how that's an experiment. What's the independent variable? Well, the independent variable is the amount of caffeine. What's the dependent variable? The levels of anxiety, hostility, and depression after the caffeine. Now let's critique this study. Is any study perfect? Absolutely not. One of the good things about being a college person studying in college is you can learn to look at these studies and you can kind of say, now wait a minute. They did this on a bad sample, or they did this on a good sample, or it makes sense, or they drew conclusions way beyond their data or something of that nature. And if you look at this particular one, what kind of critique would you make? What kind of criticisms would you make of it? How would you do it differently? Well, here's a couple of thoughts. One thing that we might do differently is come up with a better measure of anxiety, depression, and hostility. Is there some not paper pencil check thing, but a behavioral rating or a biological measure down the road? That would help tremendously. Another possibility in critiquing this is looking at the size of the group or how long they waited for the post-test after the caffeine was given. Okay? So the experiment has the beauty of being able to demonstrate to us that A seems to happen and it seems to cause B. Caffeine seems to increase hostility.